Hello everyone and welcome to PC Retro Tech. In this week's video I'm going to be looking at this massive haul of retro parts which I acquired over the past couple of weeks. So these came in two batches. There's a smaller batch on the right here and a much larger, more diverse batch on the left. So the seller for the one on the left said that he had to move house in a hurry and needed to sell his entire collection in one go, and he sold them for about €1 or €2 per card. Now, he's been through and taken out all the really valuable stuff, anything that he could sell quickly like a TsengLabs or Cirrus Logic card. But the stuff that remains is really quite interesting. So we have a bunch of video cards at the back here. There's some 16-bit I/O cards. There's a couple of sound cards that probably don't work, they're quite rusted. There's some USB cards and a Celeron riser. There's a bunch of SCSI cards in the front here. I won't be able to try those out because I don't have any SCSI drives. There are some video capture cards, and here we have a really interesting one. It's an ATI video card, but it has an IBM Power PC board on it. So I'm going to be really interested to try that out. On the right we have a bunch of video cards. Many of them are actually ISA cards, and I think a lot of them are monochrome, but there are some CGA and VGA, even EGA in there. Now this is a PCMCIA adapter. There are a few really old rare CD-ROM cards in there. Now I don't have the CD-ROMs for those unfortunately, but they're still interesting just given their age. At the back we have a collection of more mundane sound cards. There's actually a cinema card in there as well, which is quite interesting, and then a collection of I/O cards again. Now, the main plan for today's video is to go through the video cards, which are the most interesting for the channel, and I'm going to leave out all of the mundane, boring stuff like S3 Trio, which we've seen before. So there's really video cards from all eras to try out, and of course I'm going to be also interested in trying out these two cards here, which are actually 8-bit sound cards, and it's the first time I've actually ever seen these in real life. So that will be really interesting to try out. And then of course there's this mystery card on the left here, which I'm really looking forward to giving a go. I should also mention that I pulled out all the obligatory network cards and television cards that came with the collections, and they went straight to the kitchen drawer. And if you're not interested in these, just skip forward in the video a further 2 seconds. Let's begin with the 8-bit era, and the first card is actually a TsengLabs card. It's this ET4000AX. And the really cool thing about this is it seems to have a VGA port and an EGA port on it. You can see it has a lot of clock crystals, so presumably it supports a lot of different modes. The next two are almost certainly monochrome graphics and printer cards. You can tell that because they have a printer port along with the monochrome 9-pin graphics port. And these are 8-bit cards. They do have a CRT controller on it. So cards like this were actually pretty common to combine printer port with monochrome graphics, and these are usually referred to as MGP cards, monochrome graphics and printer. So I don't know whether these work. I have tried plugging them into a CGA monitor and that didn't work, but presumably you need a dedicated monochrome monitor for that. There are 3 other monochrome graphics and printer cards. This one has a mysterious VOL brand. Try finding information about that. This one has Winbond, a familiar brand, but certainly not for video cards. So that'll be interesting to try out. I have looked online, and most of these seem to be missing this ROM chip, so I presume that they didn't come with one. This one actually says Hercules on it, which gives us more of a clue. And someone's written Herc 3BC on what is presumably the BIOS chip there. And it has a TD3088A chip. Now, this card here is obviously a VGA card. This is also TD3588A. And the interesting thing about this is it has this music chip here. Now, I presume that's a brand because it is a graphics card. And I would have assumed that someone might have just inserted the wrong chip here, except that I have a similar card with the chip actually soldered in, and it says it's SVGA. This one here is what looks like a video card, but it actually says PC MIDI card on it. It's one of the two 8-bit sound cards that I talked about earlier. And I have no idea how you would connect this up. It's not a standard MIDI connector, and there are no other connectors on the board, so that one's going to be a bit of a head scratcher, I think. This one here is an 8-bit sound card, and as I said, it's the first time I've seen one of these in real life. This is an Aztec brand, and of course I'm sure that this sounds as scratchy as hell by now and probably isn't very good to listen to, but I'm still going to be really keen to see whether I can get it to work at all, and perhaps by replacing the capacitors at some point I can get that sounding quite nice. This is a fairly standard Paradise VGA card, and we've seen these on the channel before. I also have another Paradise VGA here. It's missing some chips on the left, but of course those are just an optional extra memory bank. This one here is a bit better known. It's an Actix graphics engine, and these go for really quite a lot online. It's a VGA card, and presumably it has very good performance since they're usually quite expensive. Now, I've never tried one before, so this is going to be a bit of an interesting thing to look at. This is a Paradise EGA card, but unfortunately it doesn't work at all. There were some literal bugs stuck in those RAM chips on the left there, and even after cleaning those out, there's still a dead short across this board, and it won't start up. In fact, the machine won't start up with that in there. And the final one is another VGA card, presumably something fairly generic. I can't tell what it is with an FCC sticker stuck over the chip. But you can see that it's missing the slot cover, which presumably means it's been cannibalized for parts and maybe doesn't work at all. But we'll give it a go and we'll soon find that out. There's another late entry to the eyes around, and I'd forgotten that I'd bought this. I've been buying some individual cards when they're cheap enough. This one certainly was. It was an 8-bit ISA card, actually, a VGA, but another Paradise one. The interesting thing about this actually is this little block here which says option board. So I'm going to try and figure out what that is, but otherwise it's similar to the other 8-bit VGA card that we've seen on the channel before. Unfortunately, I already hit my first problem, and that is that the only monochrome monitor that I have, this Amstrad PCMD, isn't working. I actually purchased this with an Amstrad PC1640 thinking that it was an ECD display. I did wonder why the price of the machine was so low. Anyway, there's clearly no high voltage getting to the cathode ray tube itself in this, and although it will power the Amstrad computer just fine, which means that the power supply is working, there's obviously not going to be any picture. So that means we're not going to be able to try out the monochrome graphics and printer cards, which is a bit of a shame. But I'll have to leave that for a later video if I ever get around to buying a monochrome monitor. Something that I thought would be interesting to try is to put one of those monochrome graphics and printer cards in my XT here, and then hook up my Amstrad PC ECD monitor, which is actually an EGA monitor, and see if I can get a picture. Now, this is not something that I would recommend that you try doing, but someone has to do this for science. And I did find that if I fiddle with a vertical hold on the monitor, I was actually able to get a picture. Unfortunately, it's just a flashing cursor in the upper right of the screen, and so either the video card is not working or this is just not going to give us an image. But I'm going to go through each of the MGP cards and just try this and see whether any of them give an image on the screen. It turns out that one of these cards actually gives a rolling picture like this, and it just looks like garbled text, but of course it's completely out of sync, which is an indication that it's just in the wrong video mode for this monitor. And in fact, some of the other cards, if I switch the XT over into monochrome mode, they do also give garbled text like this instead of a flashing cursor. So there's some hope that they are actually outputting a valid video signal and might be working. If you do play around with the Amstrad ECD monitor, just be aware that the horizontal hold on these is nowhere near as robust as the vertical hold. So it's just a little internal trim pot, whereas the vertical hold has an external knob on it. And unfortunately, when I was fiddling around with one of my ECD monitors with a screwdriver, the horizontal hold trim pot just exploded, and it'll need replacing. It's only a few cents to replace, but it's a little bit of a tricky repair since monitors can hold a very deadly charge, and so you don't want to be playing around inside those things unless you really know what you're doing. We know that this 8-bit VGA card works perfectly because I've actually featured this on the channel before, but the other one also works. So I now have two 8-bit VGA cards, and there's something just fun about putting a VGA card into an XT machine and firing up the game. Of course, finding a game that would run on an XT in VGA mode is another story altogether, and so I'm just using an EJ game here, Grand Prix Circuit, to show that the card is working. A little bit later I'll benchmark these cards along with all of the 16-bit ones in our 486, which we've been using for benchmarking ISA video cards. But in the meantime, I want to try and get those music cards working. I found something really quite exciting. It's a game from 1989 called Bubble Bobble, and it runs on an XT 8088 processor with Sound Blaster and with VGA graphics, and it looks beautiful, and this is what it sounds like. So that's not the PC speaker, that is the Aztec sound card, which turns out to be Sound Blaster compatible. And the thing that's really amazing is I didn't need to set up any drivers or anything, it just works. So this is fantastic. Let me just play this for a little bit so you can hear the beautiful sound that it produces. Now, as predicted, it does sound a little scratchy, especially if you change the volume knob on the back of the card, but if you leave it alone, it's actually really good. So I'm just going to start the game itself here now, and the objective of the game is to fire little bubbles at the monsters that come after you, and you can jump around with the cursor keys to try and get further up the ladder. So unfortunately it's not very easy to play, but with a little bit of practice you can eventually get some monsters. A bit of bad luck here, but in fact there I got one. Okay, so you can see it's really actually quite a lot of fun to play this game, and if you wait around long enough you can avoid the monsters. So yeah, that's Bubble Bobble. Really fantastic game, very well written, and really quite a surprise for 1989. But I guess the VGA card had come out by that point, and Sound Blasters were around, and so people were using those. So it's just really nice that you can actually run this on an XT. Now, as for that MIDI card, it's actually a Music Quest MIDI 1, and I believe that this is the ROM here. Various versions of that are Roland compatible. Now, it seems that you need a breakout cable here. It's a DB9 and it goes to two XLR cables. And that should plug into my Roland keyboard. Now, the cables are available from the US, but unfortunately nobody is offering them with customs shipping. And that's what I need here in Germany. We have very strict customs regulations here. So when one comes up, I can purchase that, and that'll be great fun for another day. The alternative, of course, is to manufacture a cable, and there's actually a great thread on Vogons with drivers and photographs of the manual and so on, and the pinout for this connector is actually given there. So it'll be very easy to set up a set of cables for this. So I might make that a video one day, and we'll see if we can get this working, but it's not something that I can do today. I'm going to do the benchmarking of the ISA video cards in our big box 486, which we built on the channel, so there's a video about that if you're interested in seeing it. And I'm just going to use the AMD 5x86 P75 chip, but I'm only going to run it at 100 megahertz. And the reason is that I don't want to push things too hard. Of course the ISA bus is constrained anyway, but I still believe that the chips can run hot, and I don't want to do that with these very old and rare video cards. I also have a couple of Visa local bus cards that I can try at the same time. So I have a CLGD5428 card, as it happens. I have tested this and it does work, but I don't know how it performs. I imagine it's exactly the same speed as the other 5428s that we've tried. But I also have a 5426, and this was actually sold as a CL542X. And you can't blame the seller for doing that. That is what's written on the PCB. But I assume that Cirrus Logic had a bunch of these PCBs made up that were sort of somehow generic, and they just mix and match chips on them as needed. So I'll be interested to see whether this is slower at all than the 5428. Again, it does work. Initially when I bought it, it didn't, but it just needed the contacts cleaned. Really required quite some work to get them to the point where they would actually reliably function. But I did manage to get this card to work. Now I'm going to be using the benchmarking suite that Phil's Computer Lab made available, and thanks Phil. And so we're going to use the 3D Bench 1.0 for slower PCs. I think this is probably the best bet for all of these cards. Some of them are certainly not going to support 640-480 modes anyway. And we're not really pushing for, the highest frames per second here, so I'm not going to run the Quake demo. I just want to get an idea of how these perform as pixel pipes, how quickly you can write to memory and so on. And 3D Bench seems to do the best job of giving that information. I was just going through the benchmarking and I hit the ET4000AX, the TsengLabs card that had the two outputs, the VJ and EJ output. And here, of course, I've just got it running with the VJ output on an LCD monitor. But at the same time, I've plugged in a CJ monitor, and you can see that it does actually display an output on the EJ port. Now, it's out of sync, of course, so I'm going to try plugging in a genuine EJ monitor and see if we can actually get a picture out of both ports at the same time. And lo and behold, we actually get a stable picture, at least when I fiddle with the vertical hold. You can see that what it's doing is taking the original VGA colors and then just picking one of the 16 colors in the EJ color palette. So it does seem that, vaguely speaking, you can actually have VGA and EJ output at the same time on this card. Which is a little bit of fun, I guess, not really meant to be taken seriously. Unfortunately, the Actix graphics engine doesn't work. I've done all the obvious things like lift the chips and reseat them, fiddle with the jumpers and dip switches, clean the contacts and so on, but no go, there's no picture coming out of this particular card. So this is based on the 86C801 chip, and not to worry, I have another one in my collection which is based on an 86C805 chip, and in fact when this comes up it actually identifies itself as an 801/805, so this is very related to the other one. The internet says that this is a diamond graphics card, although there's no markings on there to suggest that. Possibly a diamond stealth, I'm a little bit less certain of that identification. But in any case, this is certainly a very, very fast card, and I think I purchased it as more or less an unknown card at some point. So I'm going to plug this in and try it out, and the question is, can this beat the TsengLabs ET4000 Visa Local Bus card that I have, which is the fastest that we've benchmarked on the channel so far. So I'm going to put this in and try it out, and then I'll give you the benchmarks for all of the cards that I've tested today. And voila, here are all the scores. And you can see that there's really quite a range here, from 15.8 all the way up to 58.8. So the slowest ones, of course, are the 8-bit cards. Those are the two Paradise cards, and they actually performed identically, as you might expect, given that they have the same chipset on them. And a lot of people don't like the 8-bit cards because they're so slow, but I really like them. There's something really nice about putting 8-bit cards into 8-bit slots, and the performance just isn't where it's at for me. I really like the history of them. Yeah, so the other cards were all 16-bit or Visa Local Bus, but there was one 16-bit card that performed identically, and that was the TD3588A. So you remember these two cards look very, very similar, and they both had music ROMs on them, but they're actually not identical. You can see that there's a massive difference in performance between the two cards, even though they looked like they had the same chipset. When I looked a little bit closer, I realized that the second one is actually TD3588A with a little subscript 2, so it must be version 2 of the chip or something, and boy is it faster. In fact, it was the fastest 16-bit ISA card in the roundup. Now, I couldn't find out very much about these cards. I still don't know what the music is about, whether that's a feature or whether it's just a brand. But apparently the cards are made by Tamarack, and I can't find anything at all about these other than that. And they just seem to be generic brand cards. The TsengLabs ET4000AX was a bit of a disappointing performer. It only gave 20 frames per second, and I'm wondering whether all that additional circuitry for VJ and EJ output is somehow slowing it down. Or maybe it just doesn't perform that well. But that was a bit of a surprise. TsengLabs is usually known for its high-performance cards. The Paradise 88, the 16-bit card versus the 8-bit ones, gave 26.3 frames per second, which is actually pretty good for a 16-bit ISA. And that was matched by this other mystery card. That was the one that didn't have the slot cover, and you remember there was this big yellow FCC sticker on it. I just had to remove that to find out what the chipset was. I couldn't find any information on it. And it turns out that it's an NEC Pro 9000 chipset. And I had no idea that NEC made graphics chips, so that was really a find, I think. And it seems to perform pretty well. 26.3 frames per second is no slouch. So that was quite a surprise. I was very surprised to find the card worked at all, given that it was missing its slot cover. So then there are the Visa Local Bus cards, and it's not surprising that these go so much faster. We've seen this before on the channel. Visa Local Bus is really a much faster standard. It was tied directly to the CPU. And you can see that the Cirrus Logic cards perform identically, so apparently the X doesn't matter. If you see GD5426 or 5428, just think of it as GD542X. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't some games where there's some very minor differences, little tweaks, but you know, at least in this benchmark, the performance was absolutely identical. And we've seen before that the 5428 is only just behind the TsengLabs ET4000 W32, which is the fastest Visa Local Bus card we've benchmarked on the channel so far. This is not a surprise that it came out just ahead in this roundup as well. Now, of course, the ET4000 wasn't one of the cards in the two collections that I purchased. I've just included that in there because it is the fastest card that we've benchmarked on the channel. Now, for the big reveal, the 86C805, the Diamond card, actually beat the TsengLabs. This is really remarkable. It's not beat it by much, it's 58.8, but we now have a new fastest card on the channel. Or do we? So something to know about this card is that I wasn't able to get it to run at a frontside bus of 40 megahertz. I tried to run the CPU at 160 megahertz with the 4x multiplier, and it really just wasn't having it. So in fact, the Quake benchmark, which I tried to run, just crashes almost immediately. So this card really isn't stable once you start cranking up the frequency. That's in contrast to the ET4000, which does manage it. Now, of course, that could just be down to the RAM or the chipset on my particular 86C805. Maybe I've just got, you know, slightly bad silicon compared to the ET4000 that I have. But it could also be a more generic problem, so just be aware that don't run out and buy these cards because they could be the fastest. Anyway, the upshot of it is that we haven't beaten our all-time record of 16 frames per second in Quake. So we made a video about that, and you can go check that out if you like. That was with the ET4000 card. This Diamond card isn't going to do that. It's not stable. There's no way it'll get through the benchmark, which is a bit of a shame. Now this is going to be a 2 or 3 part video. I'm going to deal with the PCI and AGP and PCI Express cards in a separate video. We're now into the second day of filming here, but I thought I'd take a look at this mystery card here, and unfortunately it's not very interesting. It's actually a remote server adapter for logging into an IBM server remotely. So for example, if the operating system was messed up and you couldn't log in anymore, you wouldn't want to have to drive down to the server location just to get a terminal. So this thing would allow you to log in remotely. So it's just for server administrators. Not very interesting from a retro PC point of view, unfortunately. So that card is going straight to the kitchen drawer. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you did, give a like, and don't forget to subscribe, especially if you want to see the follow-up for all of those other cards in the collections, and we'll hopefully see you in a later video. Bye!